There is a single moment from my many years of imagining Warwick that changed everything. It came the day I received a 150-page murder case file from the Queensland State Archives. It was a winter afternoon and the sun was quickly disappearing out of my second-floor window. Heaping the file onto my desk, I untied the string and button fastener. I flipped through the pages, searching for something that I hadn't already read in the newspaper coverage. There were many telegrams between the Brisbane, Townsville, Sydney police, which gave rich details about the characters in Warwick's story. Scrawled at the bottom of the page, it was dated 6 months after Warwick's death, and it was a single, tantalising sentence.
That's Jonathan Butler, sharing the moment he was overwhelmed with emotion reading an important archive about his ancestor, Warwick Meale. His debut book, The Boy in the Dress, was nominated for the Age Book of the Year in 2022. Jonathan's book shares his search for truth about what happened to his ancestor Warwick, who was found murdered in Townsville 80 years ago, just shy of his 21st birthday. The book offers a very rare insight into Australian queer military history during World War II. My name's Kate Follington and you're listening to the podcast Look History in the Eye, produced by Public Record Office Victoria, the archive of the State Government of Victoria. 100 kilometres of public records about Victoria's past are carefully preserved in climate-controlled vaults. And we meet the people who dig into those boxes, look history in the eye, and bother to wonder why. Today's episode is a recording of our Melbourne Writers Festival event from 2022, with Jonathan Butler in conversation with Dr Yves Rees.
As the title suggests, The Boy in the Dress starts with a photograph of a boy in a dress. And that boy's name was Warwick Meale. That boy grew up to be a man who was murdered during World War II. While serving in the ADF, Warwick was killed in Townsville on a balmy night in 1944, not 94. But his killer was never found, despite a police investigation. So in this book, Jonathan goes on the trail of the cold case. He spent an impressive 10 years conducting research to exhume the truth of this 80-year-old homicide. And it's quite a wild ride, full of many twists and turns. For someone like me, who, as my podcast title suggests, I'm a big fan of archive fever, well, this book certainly delivers archive fever in spades, and it's a really, really gripping read. But this book is also so much more than true crime. It's history, both military history and queer history. It's memoir. And I think it's, above all, a really beautiful meditation on identity, family, and sexuality that asks big questions about what it means to be queer in an Australia that was and remains deeply hostile to difference. So please join me in welcoming Jonathan.
Thank you.
So Jonathan, let's start with the basics. For anyone who doesn't know the story, can you tell us who was Warwick Meale and how did you get interested in his story?
Basically, I think to understand why I dedicated over 10 years of my life to Warwick Meale, it's important that we go back to the 90s. And this is a 5-year-old Jonathan wearing his favourite witch's outfit. I basically always knew I was gay. I certainly wouldn't have called it that back then, but I certainly had a feeling that I was different, and I absolutely loved dressing up, wearing dresses, playing with Barbies, all those sort of things. I have 3 older sisters, so there was plenty of stuff flying around. The other side, though, is I always had a sense that that was wrong, that it wasn't okay for boys to like dresses, it wasn't okay to play with Barbies. And there certainly wasn't anyone telling me that it was okay either. I didn't, it wasn't spoken about at home, wasn't spoken about at school. I certainly didn't see it anywhere. I didn't see myself represented. So when I discovered this photograph that was hanging on my parents' bedroom wall of a little boy wearing a dress. You can imagine why that was so significant to me. I had this sense that it was something to be ashamed of, but I was like, oh, wait a minute, if this little boy from the olden days wore a dress sometimes, maybe there are other people like me out there. So I really instantly had this connection for as long as I can remember with Warwick. This photograph is actually of my grandmother. So on the left is Winifred, and they're cousins. So Winifred and Warwick were cousins, and they spent lots of time together growing up in their homes in Western Sydney. So this is how I'm connected to Warwick. On the left there, that's a photograph of my grandmother Winifred, a bit older obviously. And if you follow the matriline up, which feels very natural to me, you see that connection with Warwick. And yeah, that's a photograph on the right there of Warwick with his parents. So who was Warwick, and what happened to him after that photograph, of him playing dress-ups with my grandmother Winifred? So Warwick, as I said, grew up in Western Sydney, working middle-class family, went to school, after school, got a job in retail, worked in a shop, and when he was 16 years old, that's when World War II was declared, and then when he was 18, he signed up basically as soon as he could. He went to New Guinea and he served in the Signals, which is in the army, which is the division that deals with communication. And then he came back from New Guinea to Sydney, where he spent some time with his family, and then he had to go back to Townsville to be deployed back to, wherever the army wanted to take him. And then on the evening of the 15th of August, 1944, he went out drinking with his friends. They were very relaxed. It was, a quieter time for World War II. And he went for a rest on the banks of Ross Creek in Townsville. And that's where his friends had found him beaten and bloody and comatose. And he never woke from that. And that was just 2 months away from his 21st birthday. So he was 20 years old and he died. So that's who Warwick was.
And what motivated you to go on this 10-year research quest to find the killer? How did it all begin?
So I had the connection with Warwick through the photograph, but my mother loved that photograph because it's a great photo of her mother, and it's very rare to have photos from the 20s. It's a very happy photograph, but the reason behind why he was killed was a total mystery. They couldn't find a motive. They couldn't find the killer. So there was a real absence. It had a profound impact on my grandmother, which therefore impacted my mother. And so I think basically in that absence, there was a theory emerged. And that theory was that Warwick was gay and that his mysterious murder was the result of a gay hate crime. Mum had come to that through a few different reasons. There was a family rumour that Warwick was gay and that she heard a few whispers about his sexuality. But I also think the nature of the killing, it was in a public place. Mum lived in Manly in Sydney, and we've all heard of those awful gay hate killings that happened in the 70s and 80s. So there was a lot of aspects of the crime that sort of felt quite similar to that for Mum as well. So she had a theory that it was gay hate crime, and that was obviously very shocking for me. Warwick was this emblem of hope, and then I discovered that, he might have been gay and he might have been killed because of his sexuality. So basically we started because we wanted to find out the truth of what happened to him and if he was gay and if that was, the reason why he was killed.
So once you decided that you wanted to kind of go on this quest with the cold case to try and find Warwick's killer, how did you go about doing that? Like, where did you kind of begin to find information? What archives did you use? Take us on your research journey.
Sure. So my mum was a very early adopter of Ancestry.com. So, yeah, I'm sure a lot of people in the room here is on that as well. And her family had a lot of secrets and mysteries, and I think this, database, was this beacon of hope of finally finding out some answers, and so she was right onto it, and I shared a lot with my mother. I also have a very active research imagination. And, it's probably not the most common 17-year-old thing to do, but Mum and I sort of spent days on the computer looking at Ancestry.com just to try to find out, all the people in Warwick's life. And then it was also around the time of Trobe. So that was also really exciting for Mum because, we figured, and myself, because we figured if, a man was to be murdered in, during World War II in the 40s, that presumably it was published in the papers. And sure enough, it was. And straight away we got this very vivid picture of the 40s and the home front and Warwick's life and, his final night alive. So, from that moment I was absolutely hooked.
Yeah. And you used the police report as well, is that right?
Yeah, so initially at the start it was just that, and it wasn't until a bit later that I really ramped up my research. I figured that, the newspapers couldn't or wouldn't report on absolutely everything back in the day, so I really wanted to get a primary source. So real game changer was when I contacted the Queensland State Archives and was able to get the detectives' murder files. So that was 150 pages of all the correspondence between all the different police across Australia. And then that was amazing, just to find out, it wasn't, they ultimately didn't find the killer, but they did investigate a lot of people. There were a lot of eyewitnesses. There were a lot of suspects. That was absolutely fascinating to discover the details of the investigation.
And the book tells this research journey and kind of, recreates what happened to Warwick, but it also contains memoir. It tells kind of your sort of coming of age story as a young queer kid in Tasmania in the 90s and the early 2000s. Why was it important to you to kind of include your story in the book as well?
It's interesting. It wasn't it's not how I approached the story at all. I was just sort of hooked. I was obsessive about finding out whether he was gay and if that was the reason he was killed. I also was hooked into the true crime component of it as well. So I actually initially thought it was just going to be a story of Warwick and his story and, the investigation. When I was drafting an early draft, I did include a single chapter on a time that my 3 older sisters caught me wearing a dress, and just how ashamed I was and how awful that experience was. And I just included it because I wanted to demonstrate why Warwick meant a lot to me. And I gave it to Jane Rawson, who is a friend and another writer, and she really loved that. And she's like, I really love this, and it just makes it so much more powerful. I'd really love more, so just give it a go. And so I actually put the whole story aside and basically wrote my life and my sort of coming to terms with my sexuality and, my family and at school, growing up in Tassie, what that was like. And then, it was a tricky editing process weaving that together, but a lot of people do enjoy that aspect of it and say that it actually flows quite nicely. So, that was not easy, but I think the book's so much better for it.
Yeah, I certainly really love that aspect of it. And I mean, was it, as someone who's written a memoir myself, I know can be complicated writing about yourself, writing about other people. Did you feel kind of vulnerable or exposed putting your own story out there, or did it kind of come naturally to you?
Very, basically. As I said, I kind of just turned off the part of my brain that was thinking of it as a book, and it was sort of just diary writing exercise, basically. And I sort of had to try and unlock all these memories that I'd totally forgotten, and just write it. And it was incredibly personal experiences. And then it was a process of, once I actually got the book deal, I'm like, and people are actually going to read this now. Oops. And so there was a process of culling, maybe we should soften that. Maybe we should change that name. Maybe we should. And we pulled it back. There was a few edits. But, even to this day, when I flip to a page, I'm like, okay, I included that. Wow.
Whoops. Yeah. was meant to go in the editing, Cole.
Well, no, I think it's like what it was like incredibly confessional, and then I pulled it back a bit, but still that point it's quite confessional.
Yeah,
I think that's why. Yeah, but I'm glad I included it because I think it's good to. Not many people know what it's like growing up queer or growing up queer in regional Australia, so I think it's a nice exercise to build people's empathy with that sort of experience, even in a post-decriminalisation, era.
Completely. I mean, we're roughly the same age, and I was really struck reading your book how few accounts I've read of like queer millennials growing up and in regional Australia or elsewhere, and the kind of particular struggles associated with that even though, queerness was no longer criminalised, it wasn't like homophobia had magically disappeared.
Totally. And I actually was very self-conscious of that. I was very, I was speaking to my father and my mother and their generation, and it's, the stories that you hear so easily told is so horrific, like, suicide and, murder, and it's almost not shocking. So I guess when I was approaching and considering including my memoir, I was like, well, I haven't had any of those sort of experiences. Like, I
wasn't beaten up in a bathroom.
Exactly.
It can't be interesting.
Exactly. That's exactly the thought I had. And like, will people read it and be like, oh, why is he complaining? Like, he had everything, So, but I think what I wanted to capture was those really early memories and really early experiences, and how your entire world can be your family growing up, and even the slightest, reaction or word used can have such a profound impact on you growing up. And I think that's also an important story to share.
So even though your family always knew you had this interest in Warwick and connected to the photo, how did they react when you came out? Was that
so it's funny because I always thought that it was very obvious that I was gay. And because when I was growing up, my idea of my sexuality was the fact that I liked Eurovision, and the fact that I liked Barbies, and the fact that I loved drama.
Who doesn't like Barbies? I mean, they're great.
So I was like, well, it's going to be very obvious. But yeah, unfortunately, when I did actually sit my parents down and come out, it didn't go down as well as I would have hoped. I can now, in hindsight, see that they were worried because of what I mentioned earlier around those horrific stories of violence and suicide and, health challenges. Like, that was the narrative that people saw in the newspapers, on TV. So when I came out to my parents, they were like, oh no, my son's in danger, essentially. But, as a 17-year-old myself, that's not what I heard. I heard, that my parents don't accept me for who I am. And it's worth noting that we are much better now. Obviously, there was a process to go through, but initially, it was, a very, very tense experience.
Yeah. And returning to Warwick, I mean, as we've discussed, the basis of your kind of interest in him was that you thought he might have been gay as well, and he was sort of this gay elder in your family. But, as I know as a historian, and as you know as well, it's really hard to research queer lives in the past because being gay was criminalised. People didn't write about this freely in their letters and diaries. It's really hard to find evidence beyond kind of rumour and hearsay, which you had access to. But there was one key moment in your research journey where you found a piece of kind of concrete evidence about Warwick's sexuality. Could you read the section of the book that describes that moment?
I can, and I'm going to have to juggle with my microphone and book, so bear with me. Okay, so this is chapter 25, the P word. There is a single moment from my many years of imagining Warwick that changed everything. It came the day I received a 150-page murder case file from the Queensland State Archives. It was a winter afternoon and the sun was quickly disappearing out of my second-floor window. Heaping the file onto my desk, I untied the string and button fastener. Most of the tea-coloured pages had been typed, but there were handwritten notes too. The writing was almost illegible, scratched in cursive letters with thick black ink. I flipped through the pages, searching for something that I hadn't already read in the newspaper coverage. There were many telegrams between the Brisbane, Townsville, Sydney police, which gave rich details about the characters in Warwick's story. I set them aside. A scrawled at the bottom of the page caught my attention. It was dated 6 months after Warwick's death, and it was a single tantalising sentence. It read, "A suggestion has been made that Meale might have been a pervert." Pervert was a common term used by law enforcement at the time to refer to a homosexual. In other words, the police were saying that Warwick might have been gay. It was an electrifying moment. I like to think I'm not a melodramatic person, but reading that scrawled sentence, I cried. Self-doubt had been haunting me throughout the entire investigation. I wanted to believe that Warwick was gay and that we had some deeper connection because of it, but evidence was hard to pin down. Now I had finally found a primary source. My instincts and my mother's may have been correct after all.
Big moment. And it sounds like a really complex moment because you'd found this kind of evidence that you'd been looking for, but it came in the form of this word pervert, which of course is a slur. And, I think this is really kind of illustrative of a problem that we face doing queer history, that we're constantly confronted with the homophobia and the bigotry of the past. So I'm interested, how did you kind of navigate that in your research journey as someone who's queer yourself, kind of doing a deep dive into hatred towards queerness in historical Australia?
I think by that point, because I was so obsessively researching and I was so obsessively looking for evidence, ironically, it was like a positive moment, I think.
Yes, pervert.
Obviously it's an awful word and, my first reaction was quickly research, what did that even mean? And so I think in the acute moment, it was positive because I was it was finally some evidence. But I often do wonder, I actually was interviewed by someone doing their PhD in this topic of what's the impact for queer researchers, because it's just an onslaught of hate and awful language. And the fact that researching the book, I did look into a lot of other gay hate crimes, looked at incredibly homophobic laws and treatment in the military and in the state. And, I do feel now I'm kind of looking for more positive and happy stories and happy experiences, because it was a very long time of staring a really, ugly time of Australia's history in the face.
You don't want to spend another 10 years researching homophobia and hate crimes.
No, and people tell me to. I'm like,
On this question of queer history and how it's researched, another question that kind of gets talked about a lot is this question of language and how to refer to people. Today we obviously have words like queer and trans and gay and lesbian, but they weren't really in circulation in the same way as in the 40s, the decade you were researching. So how did you sort of work out how to talk about people and what words to use?
Yeah, that was tricky. I tried to use the words that they used in the archives. Hence the emphasis on the word pervert. Obviously, it's an awful word, but it was the word that the detectives used. There's another story that I came about where the forces were investigating evidence of some Australian soldiers who were having sex with American soldiers, both male, and they called themselves the New Guinea Girls. So I used that term to refer to them as well. I guess the umbrella term of queer can be helpful as well, because queer just means, not straight basically, or, something...
Just a bit queer.
So I tried to sort of use those broader terms. But, it definitely was challenging, because I know that that's a real risk of conducting, queer historical research, is transposing our ideas today into the past. But, when you just sort of drill it down to, same-sex desire and behaviour, it's, pretty clear that there are some commonalities between the two.
Yeah. On this kind of question of, the history of same-sex desire, one thing that really I find really fascinating about kind of Warwick's story is, I suppose, how gender and sexuality kind of intersect. It's called The Boy in the Dress. You as a child seeing that photo kind of, took it as a sort of hint of Warwick's perhaps same-sex desires. But I suppose, for me as a trans person, having read a lot of trans literature, a boy in a dress is a real kind of trope of a kind of trans feminine coming of age story. So I suppose I'm interested, like, did you kind of ever think about if there might have been things going on with Warwick's gender, or kind of think about how that side of things?
I also want to say that I absolutely love this question because something I've noticed as well, I've been fortunate enough to do a lot of media for the book, and typically when I'm speaking to a journalist, and if that journalist happens to be a straight male...
which many journalists are. Shock.
There's a lot of, like, it's the opposite reaction. It's often like, oh, we all dressed up, don't think I'm gay, sort of like reaction. So I kind of love the idea of, like, actually you didn't go far enough with the gay.
Maybe Warwick was even queerer.
Yeah, exactly. I like that. I think there's probably two answers.
Yeah.
One answer is probably like blindness, my own self. So I think a lot of this book is a document of my research that I went through, and a line share. As I said, it was sort of from when I was 18, a lot of the research was done when I was in 25. So there certainly was an aspect of me not, even considering the trans aspect, and me just seeing the boy wearing a dress as a queer thing, and that's something that I identify with, and drag and that sort of thing. I think the second part of the answer, though, is that something I found really interesting about queer history is that, and it kind of goes back to your question around, what terms to use. Yeah. So another word that was used a lot was invert, and at the time, gender and sexuality weren't as distinct as we think of them today. That, there was another phrase that often uses, oh, I thought he was effeminate, but, and, as that meaning that he was gay and that he, had sexual relations with men. And so it's quite porous relationship between gender and sexuality back then. And I guess growing up myself, as I was saying, my sense of my sexuality was linked to me wanting to wear dresses and loving female things, and, really identifying with my 3 older sisters and girls in my family. So I think I actually quite relate to that 1940s view, I suppose, of sexuality, that gender and sexuality are kind of porous. But yeah, obviously not too, and that's different for every single queer person, and that makes it incredibly a complicated field to talk about and to write about. But for me, that certainly was the case.
Yeah. And you mentioned a moment ago that, one of the sort of contextualising things you researched were other kind of gay hate crimes. And I believe one of them you researched right here at Prov, or the Victorian Archive Centre. Can you tell us a bit about that case?
Yeah, certainly. I do want to be aided by visuals for this one. So I'm going to make everyone dizzy. Nope, here we go. So broadly speaking, the detectives explored 3 ideas of who killed Warwick. One was that it was an American sailor, and I think we've all heard about the tensions between the US and Australian forces, mostly over women. When lots of guys got together and drunk, they thought, okay, maybe it was just a drunken brawl that went too far, and so that was one of the theories. The other theory was that it was just someone who'd returned from war and had been so psychologically damaged that they just randomly killed Warwick with no reason whatsoever other than a destroyed mind, as they said. The third theory that they investigated was that note that I found in the archives and that I read just earlier around Warwick's sexuality. And the reason behind that question is the reason why my research went from the Queensland State Archives to this building, to Prov, was because of a man called Norman Brooke and Jack Edward Lloyd. So 6 months after Warwick was murdered, there was a very, very similar case that actually happened down here in Mornington Peninsula. and it was at Balcombe Camp, which is that photograph on the top there. The gates are still there. And basically the detective on the case up in Townsville saw a newspaper article of this case and was like, wow, there's a lot of similarities. It was the night of a dance, lots of drinking. There was a weapon of opportunity, so just grabbed from nearby. And they were all part of the same signals unit as well. And it was outside. It was just, there was too many similarities for them to ignore. So the detectives actually investigated whether Norman, who was the perpetrator of this crime, was in Townsville at the same time and potentially could have been the one who killed Warwick. This case was absolutely fascinating. So broadly speaking, Jack was had the nickname of Dulcie, and he was a bit of a character. He was incredibly effeminate. He was described as not being able to do a single thing in a way that a man would do it. He had no sporting ability. The way he spoke provided much entertainment, and they all really loved him for it. They thought it was great. They used to yell out, "I'd go you, Jackie," and "I'd go you, Dulcie," and there seemed to be a lot of they really loved this character. But unfortunately, on this night of a dance, the Jack propositioned Norman. So there's a map there on the top left. It's probably a bit faint, but basically there's where the dance was, where the huts are, and across the Nepean Highway is Murphy's paddock. So Norman was on picket duty. He had a formal job to do. So Jack said, "Let's go for a walk around the paddock to sober up." And then Norman claimed that Jack made an unwanted sexual advance, and then that's why he so brutally attacked Jack and ultimately killed him. So this was an incredibly fascinating case. I got all the court files from the archives and looked through them. And it was a really interesting case because they had to really grapple with this idea of sexuality. So they investigated all of Jack's, they got witness testimonies from all of Jack's fellow soldiers. And it was really interesting to hear them say, like, "Oh yeah, he was effeminate." They basically were saying everything I was saying, but they were like, they always stopped short of, "Oh, but he actually wasn't a pervert," or "He didn't actually have sex with men," or would never admitted that or said that that was the case. So really interesting from a point of sexuality and gender, and challenging that assumption that potentially queer people in the military were only closeted and were deeply terrified of the repercussions, that maybe there were some flamboyant camp people that were happy to be themselves. The other fascinating aspect of this case was that Norman got away with it. So how did that happen? Basically, he claimed that Jack had made an unwanted sexual advance and therefore it was provoked, and that the entire male jury, it's worth mentioning, acquitted him of everything, and Norman just walked free and lived a long life until he was in his 80s. When I read that, as you can imagine, I was shocked. I was like, he literally admitted to killing this man. Like, why has this happened? And that led me to discover the gay panic defence. And the gay panic defence, for those who don't know, is this idea, it's based on really sketchy psychology, that there is some sort of psychological reaction in a straight man if they get hit on by a gay man, and therefore their murder can be downgraded. And there's been numerous cases across the world of this being used. And believe it or not, it actually was a viable legal strategy up until 2020 in South Australia. So it's not ancient history. 2018 in Queensland. So yeah, it's basically provocation legal strategy, and it was used in a lot of cases, mainly murder down to manslaughter. So yeah, through discovering Jack's story, I learnt this really awful part of queer history as well.
Yeah, and that just speaks volumes about, the way homophobia was embedded in, the institutions of this country and the legal system and, elsewhere. I wanted to ask more generally about the kind of the queer history of the military, which was a big part of your research. I think in the popular imagination, we don't ordinarily think of the military as being a particularly queer space because it kind of is so associated with, a kind of toxic masculinity, a really blokey, aggressively straight culture. But as you found, that is not the case. Yeah. Can you tell us a bit about that long queer history in the ADF?
Yeah, sure. So Basically, with my research, I got the trove and I got all the archival evidence as well. And then there were a few gaps, and I basically wanted to work out, okay, well, if Warwick was gay, what was that like? And did people exist? I certainly, I went through the same Year 10 curriculum as a lot of people and learned about World War II, and I certainly didn't learn about queer people. But, it didn't take long for me to find all that amazing research that has been done in the last few decades into queer history in the military. And surprise, surprise, there were queer people.
Shock, horror.
Yeah, and I will go back to this slide. So these were really important texts that I used in researching this book. Yorick Small's Sex Soldiers and the South Pacific, Serving in Silence, Graham Willett, Noah Reisman and Shirlene Robinson as well. These books were absolutely amazing. They really step out all the sort of available evidence that we have, sort of people, reflecting on their experiences during World War II, also, the cases that happened as well. So it was pretty shocking to learn that, this is such a huge part of our national story that just isn't told that as much as it should be.
Why don't we celebrate it on Anzac Day?
I know. But I should mention that I'm sure many people saw that there's a wonderful exhibition at the moment at the Shrine of Remembrance about queer history in the military. So things are certainly changing. But yeah, for a long time, it was outright denied or to the point of erased from our history books and not talked about or acknowledged.
And even, as we saw, I think last year with Peter Dutton, forbidding celebrations of, was it Ida Hobbit Day?
Yeah, it was.
In the military. It shows that there, still is some way to go in acknowledging that part of our military culture.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think that was sort of why I really wanted to write this book as well, is I think, it is an awful reaction to Ida Hobbit Day to say, no, you're not allowed to wear rainbow clothing. But I guess on the surface, and if you don't think of it historically, you can be like, so what, it's just what you're wearing.
Yeah.
But then I guess if you understand the history of the mistreatment of queer people in the military, then just it makes it even more awful.
Yeah. And I want to kind of delve into that question, I suppose, of the power of telling histories of marginalised and oppressed groups. I'm obviously a historian by training, so this is something I think about a lot. The way in which various groups, whether it's sort of women, Indigenous people, Black communities and queer communities, have kind of undertaken history-telling projects as a real part of a kind of broader liberation project. And I think, that can take so many forms. It's sort of about proving that we exist, but it's also about finding a sense of kind of lineage and community. I'm interested in your thoughts on this question, Jonathan. Like, was this your instance of queer history? Did you see that as a kind of a political thing, a form of activism or protest?
Yeah, I think so. I think even when I embarked, I think I had the assumption that World War II history was dull, that it was, it's all strategies and, weapons and that sort of side of things. So even embarking on this project, I was a bit hesitant that would anyone be interested in a story like this because, that reputation of World War II history. But I think that perception is just a result of what I've been taught, and it wasn't that full story. I certainly saw the potential in, telling a story about, queer people in World War II from the perspective of a 20-something gay guy might actually sort of broaden that story and make people realise, that our national story is a bit more complex than what we're told. I think on the surface, I suppose you could think of it as, activist. I think one of the reactions that I get from people reading this book is, I knew it was bad. I had no idea it was that bad. So I think just making people aware of, how bad it was, and, how far we've come, but also how far we have to go.
Why the queers are so angry.
Exactly. I think it's really good context and to understand what we still need to continue to fight for as well. But yeah, I think that I do see it as activists. I think I was listening to NGV recently had a queer exhibition, and there was a podcast, and I was speaking to one of the artists, and they described she did these very hyper masculine art pieces, and she described it as sort of like a Trojan horse of her kind of sneaking into this like hyper masculine world and then vandalizing it.
Yeah.
And then I heard that, I was like, have I done the same thing? Because I've taken this very traditional masculine topic, even true crime can be, or crime can be quite masculine, and told a story about a gay boy growing up in regional Tasmania and, all these queer people in the military. There's a lot of, sex in there as well. So I kind of like the idea that I'm sort of like, a bit of a Trojan horse.
Yeah, well, that leads nicely to what I wanted to ask as well, I suppose, about this question of audience and how the book is sort of positioned. True crime, military history, as you've said, are pretty masculine, blokey, straight kind of fields. They also sell very well, so it's sort of advantageous to kind of position a book in that way. But as you've said, this is a really queer book. So I suppose, how did you think about audience when you were writing it? Like, were you writing for a queer audience, a military history audience? And how did you kind of navigate that dynamic?
I didn't write for an audience at all, and I know a lot of writers say that. But so my mother became quite ill. She was diagnosed with multiple systems atrophy, very awful degenerative disorder. But one thing that she said to me, because I kind of took over the reins of the research, was, you must tell Warwick's story. And to be honest, my reaction was like, sure, but no one's going to want to read it. Like, why? It's World War II, it's queer history, it's true crime, it's memoir. Like, surely there's no audience out there for that. So the entire experience, I had very low hopes of it ever being published, let alone read. But I think it was an interesting process to go through once it was taken up, and I was very conscious of, that tension, I suppose, of, if Warwick in a dress was on the cover instead of what it is at the moment with Warwick in his uniform. Looking quite manly. If it sort of was a bit more... some of the reactions I have got is anger. A lot of people have been angry that the Trojan horse thing, I suppose, that they were lured into a true crime World War II story, and they're like... And
there were homosexuals in it. And outrage.
Yeah. Absolutely. I didn't want to learn about this coming out story and rah, rah. So there has been a bit of anger around that for people who got lured in. I suppose it's called The Boy in the Dress. It's in the title. But yeah, I suppose the way, if you just sort of picked it up and looked at the blurb, and you might not realise just how many queer themes are actually inside the cover.
Shocking. And as you've said, your mum really encouraged you to finish the book, and the book's dedicated to her, but sadly she, is not here to see it. How do you think she'd feel about the book in the flesh, though, if she was here?
She would be absolutely ecstatic. Absolutely ecstatic. She, so one of the biggest challenges for us doing this research was that her mother, Winifred, was very secretive, and Warwick was totally out of bounds. Like, you weren't allowed to talk about it. Very brief conversations, and stopped straight away. Mum was exactly the opposite. She was all about sharing and telling, and just nothing, in her view, and I've inherited it as well, nothing good can come of secrets and hiding. It's only, and in fact she was hurt quite a lot through family secrets, that sort of thing. So I think she'd be so happy that this is out in the world. She'd be really proud that it was written by me, that it's found an audience. But it was really important to me that I made that part of the story, because obviously I inherited my love of research through Mum. I inherited my ability to sit at a computer for like weeks and weeks and weeks from Mum. She didn't see it become a book, but I was able to read her early chapters at the nursing home, which she absolutely loved, and she hated when I stopped. And she did see the equal marriage plebiscite result, and she was so happy. So when I came out when I was young, she was quite worried, but through researching and talking about Warwick's story together, it actually became quite a positive experience and created a space for us to talk about sexuality, and then for her to then see equal marriage and be absolutely ecstatic. It was, it was a really lovely story, and one that I really share with Mum. Unfortunately, she passed away just 2 weeks after the equal marriage result. So just to give you a sense of the timeline. So she didn't see the book, but I'm glad that she saw the equal marriage happen. That was a huge milestone for both of us.
Yeah, that's wonderful. We're going to go to audience questions in a few minutes, so get ready. But before we do that, I just want to sort of touch finally on the craft of your writing and the way you've written this history in this memoir, because that is so beautiful and kind of deserves to be acknowledged in its own. As a historian who works in academia, I read a lot of history that is quite dry. I won't be afraid to say. But I'm a huge believer in doing historical research that is rigorous and, very intelligent and, engages with the kind of other literature, but is also just really readable and beautifully written. And that's one of the things I really appreciate about your book. So one thing I really like is the way, that it's kind of written like a novel in a sense, that you include like sensory details and bits of dialogue that you'd normally see in a kind of historical novel. Can you tell us about that kind of craft of shaping those details?
Yeah, so it was a really big part of this project is I really wanted to make it visual. So I studied photography at university.
Yeah, so you're a visual person.
I'm quite visual, and I really wanted to be evocative, and I really wanted to centre a real world experience. Like I read a lot of the academic texts, and I really wanted to know about the person and what it felt like and what it smelt like and what it felt like to be there. So a lot of my research was guided by that question. I think all the archives listed above really helped me get those details. But I think, one thing I will point out is the Australians at War Film Archive. I don't know if anyone's heard of that before, but there's hours and hours of interviews with people who served in our wars. So one person would have an 8-hour interview, and they would talk about what they had for breakfast. They would talk about what the streets looked like. They would talk about what the dance was like and if it was fun, or, what the dynamics were. So that was just, as you can imagine, amazing to get this really evocative detail that made it into the book. I was quite lucky with all the court cases that they do actually quote a lot of the dialogue. So a lot of the dialogue is actually from archival sources. So I didn't make that up. It was actually drawn from that. I think obviously Trobe was really helpful in getting those the details of
like you can find
stories.
What the weather was that day.
Exactly.
And things like that.
Exactly. Yeah. Yep. I tried to do that as well. And I wanted to do things like find menus. So, American diners were becoming more popular on the home front. So I wanted to know what they would have been eating and drinking. There was air raid shelters were really important. So what did they look like? Photographs were obviously really great. Lots of photos and videos on the Australian War Memorial website. I was very conscious that a lot of this stuff is in black and white. I really wanted to think in colour. So paintings were amazing for that. So you can see there's a painting of Townsville Beach. And you can see all the characters of the Americans and Australians. And there's, barbed wire along the water. So that was really interesting detail. Warwick was a linesman. What did that look like? So there's an artist impression of that. And I found out that there was a squadron that baked bread every morning. So what would have that smelt like? What did, the cross-dressers look like that performed for the, they got time off and went to the beach. So, if I was a queer person, what would have they noticed and looked at? So, I definitely wanted to fill in that rich detail, but 100% grounded in archival research.
Yeah, which is, really a remarkable achievement. And there is, though, also some kind of speculation and imagination in the book as well. Can you tell us about your decision to include a bit of that?
Yeah, I think I wanted it to be, I wanted it to be a document of my investigation. So I always wanted to make that upfront, that it's what the questions that I was asking of the archives and the things that I wanted to find. So I made sure that was, front and centre. I think the other aspect comes back to what we were talking about, queer history and the complexity of queer history. I learnt a lot about the limitations of recorded life. If I just took, the primary historical research of Warwick and Jack, I would just tell the story of murder. I would just tell the story of the army because there's a great document of the army. But, what about that lived life that wasn't recorded? It was illegal to be gay in the military and in life. So, writing a letter or telling anyone or, writing in a diary could get you in a lot of trouble. So I was just very conscious that there was a lot of unrecorded life. So I did try and find recorded life. So that was why finding archival documents of people that were brave enough to do this, and I actually brought that into the book as well. I think there is definitely reimagining going on, but I'm very confident that it's all sort of based on historical research.